Good morning, everybody. Well, this is the presentation, as the title says, on value chains. And this is all in the context of the emerging transformation today. We are in 2023. A lot of things has been happening in the last 10, 15, 20 years. We went from this period of hyper-globalization to something which different people describe in different ways, but there are signs of deglobalization. So I will try to give you kind of my take on this global transformation that we are facing. So I will start first with the pointing to the global value chain globalization and what are its kind of trade-offs, what are its complexities, And then the core of presentation will be on the factors which are affecting the process and reconfiguration of global value chains, because this is a process which is driven by a variety of forces, technological, economic, political. So I try to structure that. And then I will provide a few bits and pieces of evidence on the position of EU and Central Eastern Europe in that context compared to the other regions. I don't think there will be much time, but I'll just put one slide on the role of the government to affect this process. It's an huge policy agenda which comes from the transformation that we are seeing today, and it's highly political set of issues which is emerging today. So the start is that basically one can describe current globalization as global value chain based globalization. You can see I put here some statements from different scholars who point to this fundamental qualitative change which global value chains brought, idea that they have transformed the world and that the future of globalization is closely linked to the future of global value chains. The specificity of global value chain integration is that it is not primarily about the preferential market access. This is very nicely spelled out by Richard Baldwin, who points that global value chains are broader range of activities which are around the trade, around the investment services, intellectual property rights. This is logical when you have such a close integration of tasks of different bits and pieces of value chain. That requires a much closer integration of partners, and the tariff, conventionally seen trade liberalization is not sufficient, which obviously poses challenge for the major actors in that process, because this is not about the reducing tariffs, but it is about the harmonization of rules. One of the drivers of the finally, relative success of the EU is exactly in this institutional convergence, but global value chains would require that it goes on a global level. Global supply chains are transforming the world, or have been transforming the world all until recently, but this doesn't go without conflicts. And I put here, a screen or picture with Donald Trump with his statement, which points that this globalization that we have seen has produced a variety of effects across different parts of the globe, and the rise of populism is partly related also to the issue of globalization, but I'll try to explain a little bit more about it. So what the conflicts are about. The way how I can look at it is a kind of looking at the trade-offs of global value chains from the opportunity side, and what are the challenges that they are, raising or generating. First, there are lots of kind of good things about the global value chain based integration. First is that this type of globalization reduces barriers to entry. There are higher opportunities for companies to get access to complementary resources. In some sense, barriers to entry are lower because you don't have to have competence and skill in the complete range of skills which are required for one product, but you can be good in specific tasks, in segments, and this reduces your barriers to entry, increases opportunities for being part of the global economy. That also creates opportunities for technological learning, because then you're part of a technological system, of a bigger supply chain, and it offers you opportunities to acquire new skills. On Also, what is a positive, in that case, we have this opportunity to separate R&D from production. And this is very good for emerging economies because you may not have R&D skills, not skills in design, but you have a production capability skills, and this separation is something which is quite positive. So you're part of a larger system where you have opportunities for fast learning, which can lead to higher productivity gains, and you can see it in these plants which are plugged into the system, that they can be in emerging economies, that they can be highly productive. Also, if you have opportunities to expand the value chains, then there is also increasing opportunities for co-location of different activities in the country. So it kind of caters for a very segmented type of activities and skills, but also if there is a developed system within the economy that also offers opportunities for co-location. Now, so this is a nice part of the story. What are the challenges? Challenges are quite also significant. First is that the production system, they become disintegrated and geographically dispersed. That is a kind of obvious from the spatial perspective. And if you had countries which had a vertically integrated national production systems, then global value chains will erode that. The best example for that is the Southern Europe, which lost 1 million manufacturing jobs, where previously kind of integrated production system have been through China, in fact, eroded and segmented. If you think about the North Italy, then this is one good example. What is the biggest issue with the value chains is so-called modularity trap, where you're part of the supply chain, your bargaining power is relatively limited. You may have increases in productivity, but it doesn't mean that your profitability goes up. So this is a kind of a structural feature which comes through the different bargaining power, different players. And that means that the previously regions which were kind of more diversified, they now have become more narrowed down in terms of their specialization. They're focused on narrowly stage-specific parts of the value chain, which means that there is erosion or depletion of regional and national industrial ecosystem. And of course, that leads to great inequalities in profitability between different type of firms. So if you are lead firms, if you are platform leader, then your position is quite different if you are somewhere down the value chain. So the point here is that we have these trade-offs. There are opportunities, but there are also challenges in that context. So the, sorry, next slide. Let me just try to turn it. Yeah. So I want to dwell a little bit on this issue of delinking innovation from production, because it has important global implications. So if you think about the known cases like Apple, then its advantage is solely in intangible activities, design, distribution, retail. And that was the initial idea, developed world will do design, and then, China factory, emerging economies, will do the rest. Now, obviously, after 20 years, that system didn't seem to kind of lead to the overall welfare, because the issue is how you can, sustain the economy of like US of 200 million people and something, based only on the intangible activity. So that led to huge regional inequalities, to the effect that the losses which came through these global reallocations were not kind of compensated, or the losses were not, there was no substituting economic activities. We have these deprived areas, and that led to a rise of populism. I mean, UK is one of the also good examples in that respect. The point is that this reallocation of production activities leads to a loss of knowledge, and that loss of knowledge comes from the separation of product design from operation. So the idea is, or the argument is, that once you relocate your manufacturing productivities, you're not just relocating manufacturing, but you are also then gradually relocating and part of your design capabilities. Firm lose control over their know-how, their organization competencies. You have contract manufacturers in the other parts of the world that gradually then go also upstream, And this was the kind of very much concern in the US. We had now for 10 years established, research on that. This is just one of the examples, big projects, which have looked at these issues quite substantially. Then the main point here is that the process and product manufacturing, they are equally important in the innovation development, and this delinking has its limitations. Let me just go further. To the other bit of evidence which points to that is that manufacturing, however small it is part of in terms of overall economy, in terms of share of GDP, basically the majority of the R&D is still done in manufacturing. So here you have figures which show the share of manufacturing in total business R&D in different countries. So you see from 60 to 80–90%. So that means that despite the lower share, the knowledge content or the skill element, sophistication is still within that part of the economic activity. So this phenomena and this delinking, which I'm pointing, is maybe not so relevant for Eastern Europe, but it's globally, it's actually one of the crucial drivers why we have these conflicts which are emerging today, because it becomes it is shifting more towards the competition for technology. That led also to these contradictions of the system, which can kind of have expanded global value chain on a large scale, and this had led to contradictions of hyperglobalization. We now can call it hyperglobalization. I mean, 10 years ago we were not aware of it, but what are these contradictions? On one hand, positive side that you have gains from specialization. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget that there are still states, there are industrial policies, and there is also drives to diversify. So there is a kind of, not conflict, but there's a trade-off between how much you gain from specializing and how much you gain from diversifying, going into new activities. This is maybe less of an issue for smaller economies, but for larger economies, this is quite relevant. If you think about the China, then this is the major issue. From optimistic side, there was this expectation by economists: oh, globalization will lift all the boats, we will all benefit, and losers will be compensated. What we can see clearly now, that there are winners and losers of globalization, and that this naive, idealistic mechanism of compensating the losers really doesn't work. In the reality, it's much more complex. Third issue is that the global value chain requires a kind of political space which is a multi-level, requires harmonization between local, global governance level, regional. The success of EU is partly a reflection of that. But on the other hand, we should also take into account that nation states are still the primary political space, and that there will be conflicts, and the extent to which these global value chain globalization will be reformed in terms of local governance and global governance is something which is obviously a highly political issue, because there is this major player of the nation states. Finally, the logic of the contradiction is also that idea is that if we lift all the boats, there will be positive sum logic. We have to cooperate, and everybody will benefit at the end. But if we bring nation state, if we bring in the context kind of considerations of national security, geopolitical competition, we may end up in a completely different world. We may end up in a world of zero-sum logic. And this is where we can do global economy is today, in between understanding what are the benefits of cooperation and then zero-sum logic, which kind of can lead to basically decline and the really stagnation of the global economy, where nobody will benefit. So these contradictions, they led today to two terms which we never thought we'll be thinking about, to something which is called globalization, which is a slowdown in global integration, which is not exactly the deglobalization. But the idea is from analysts like Paul Antras that hyperglobalization that we experienced until the global financial crisis is simply not sustainable. Of course, there are new arguments which points we are actually moving not to globalization, but this is de facto globalization, which means that there are signs of the process of weakening of interdependence among nation states. This has come also part of the agenda of international business scholars. So this points that this came to micro level. So. Of course, this is a highly contentious area. There are different views on that, but this is the setting where we are kind of now operating. So now in 2020s, I would say that we have this period of transformation from this period of liberalization, export-led growth policies, global value chains proliferating, which led to declining cost of trade, finer slicing of production processes, and then more complex coordination of supply chain. We are now seeing very strong signs of protectionist tendencies. This is also related to gradual decline in return on FDI and the emergence of digital multinational enterprises, which raise a host of new issues because they are very asset-light. What is their physical presence? And because they're in data economy, then it leads to huge conflicts in terms of political economy. Just think about the issues of access to China of this type of companies, and then you will get what type of issues we are facing today. To give you a bit of evidence on this, if you just take a simple index, which is this UNCTAD, the Transnationality Index, which takes into account the share of asset sales and employees of leading transnational companies, then we can see here that we had this interrupted growth all until the second half of the last decade, where we see that this is plateauing now. It's kind of saturating. So we see that even on that level, there are clear changes. If I take China, then one could say, yeah, China was kind of increasing its export share, was starting to dominate as a trading power as well. But then we see from the 2008 or 2005, we see that this process is declining, which is a sign of kind of this retreat of hyper globalization. If I take just FDI and I take countries, 3 unrelated countries, but they have significance for us. If I take Poland, Russia, and China, and then you see that this trend of some kind of, I wouldn't say delinking, but of decreasing relevance of FDI has started much earlier. It started actually from 2007, and if I was to take the other countries, that would be kind of similar phenomenon. There was expectation that with the COVID, this will go back, but we see that this seems to be a structural trend, and that COVID hasn't actually changed fundamentally that trend. On the other hand, there are analysts again point to Richard Baldwin, who is extremely productive in this area, who is kind of having a counter argument. His argument, yes, globalization in trade in goods has probably peaked, but don't forget that what we see in China, the graph which I showed you before, is just a normal thing because such a large economy cannot be so open. So China is becoming, in terms of openness, like US, like Europe. So this is basically going just back to the normal. And his point is that we should not forget that there is an area of globalization which is still in kind of very early stages. And he points to this globalization in trade and services, which hasn't peaked. His new work is about globalization in services, and there's a lot of true in there. My point here is that, yes, there is absolutely true in this case, but this is looking kind of from a more optimistic perspective on the whole issue, because these are technological, economic opportunities which come from the trade in services, but there are factors which are also working against that trend. And here I come kind of to my crucial kind of framing of structuring of the current situation of transformation, which I see as a confluence, as an interaction of several forces. And I will try in the rest of this presentation to point to each of these 4 forces. So the first type of force or structural driver is the emergence of Industry 4.0, which comes through automation. There is this phenomenon of digitalization of services, which are strong drivers towards the kind of increasing technological interdependence. There are new technological opportunities. This is an important driver of globalization, but we will also see that also there are factors here which are hindering further globalization. The second factor is the sustainability imperative or greening imperative, you can call it. And this is the idea, you know, that we can have a global economy where you have transportation costs around, where any bits and pieces can move around the globe costlessly. Now, with the when we understand environmental costs, when we see these climate change effects, then the whole kind of new agenda emerges, which pushes towards the kind of more regionalization or localizations. I'll say a little bit about that. But there are two new factors which are kind of really of very recent origin. On the right-hand side, we have this increasing techno-economic nationalism or protectionism, which is a kind of logical effect of the, let's say, emergence and the growing role of larger economies, BRIC economies. China is important in that respect, Brazil, India. You know, but this is something which one would expect. In a sense, in a multipolar world, in a world where we have this shift in power between advanced and the emerging economies. So this is something which kind of a few years ago, OECD analysts would call it shift 1 and shift 2. You know, shift 1 is, you know, this country joining global economy, and the shift 2 is whether they will be really dominating in that economy. But I separate that. This is for me a structural trend from something which you see very recently, and that is the increasing role of geopolitics and geopolitics-driven supply chains. This is not only visible in the COVID and how different countries reacted on the issues of supply during the COVID period, all this resilient crisis, but we see it through two new phenomena which are extremely relevant for us today. First is the increasing decoupling between US and China. And these are the very dangerous supply chain disruptions, which may be in terms of global impacts of a huge importance. Of course, to that, we should add Ukraine war, which is in our proximity. But if we kind of put it in the context of US-China decoupling, that's kind of really on different order of magnitude. Of course, we feel very intensively today the effects in terms of energy, food, and raw material supply breakdowns, which come from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the whole uncertainties related to that. So I will try to, you know, highlight very briefly each of these four elements and how they impinge on the globalization or deglobalization. So I said already, technology is a significant force for globalization. Digital technologies and digital services, they're new tradables because of this phenomenon, very nicely described again by Baldwin of telemigration, where you can provide services on a distance. And with the AI, this is something which really is still in the early stages, but may fundamentally change the nature of the service activities. We talked today about this servicification, blurring boundaries between the services and manufacturing, which offers you also increased supply chain control and interaction. So it kind of really bring closer, but also controlling closer parts of your supply chain. But let's not forget also that there are contradictory forces when it comes to technology. We have today additive manufacturing, robotics, and artificial intelligence, which actually reduce international production in terms of leading to concentration more of value in design and of moving back production stages because they can be produced locally. Think about the additive manufacturing, 3D printing. These are type of activities which can lead to nearshoring, because it can lead to integration of previously outsourced activities. And this is something which is extremely relevant for Central Eastern Europe, the extent to which this will happen. And also in that context, digital multinationals are fundamentally different in that context. It's very difficult to say how they are affecting all of that, because in some sense they are huge drivers of further globalization, but because of the issues related to data economy, they can be actually force of the opposite direction. So that is a kind of contradictory features of technology, which on one hand are force for globalization, but on the other hand, they also force for deglobalization. When it comes to a second factor, which I mentioned, that is this increasing creeping protectionism, then we have here a kind of two factors. One is the obviously drive of growing protectionism, but as Paul Andres rightly points, look, you already built this supply chain. There are fixed and sunk costs of already established global value chains. There is a kind of GVC stickiness. So, don't expect that everything will go back. And actually, when you look at the evidence on the nearshoring, reshoring, there is a much less basis for optimism. And that's why I kind of put this geopolitics inside, because geopolitics may change completely this logic and what are the fixed and sunk costs, geopolitics will work against the economy to a large extent. Here we also have this protectionism, which is therefore driven by the geopolitics, which is a separate factor, which I'll say a little bit more, but it's also protectionism, which is driven through these contradictions of globalization. Protectionism comes through these inequalities which cause this backlash, and this is what drives this gradual process. Of course, this can take now the banner of resilience, but in a peaceful world, in a world where we have a kind of liberal regime, the whole issue of resilience would be different. So very often we will now use that as a justification for something which is actually protectionism. Of course, globally, that leads to fundamentally different situation where we move from previously multilateral governance regime to something which is now kind of very much unclear what it is. What is that kind of new global governance regime that we are going towards? And this is where our hope lies. Our hope lies in this context in the imperative of sustainability. Why? Because sustainability is something which, however politics can go its own direction, is extremely relevant in terms of ensuring the global resilience, that the planet can survive, and imperative to do something about the climate change. Transportation costs are extremely important in that respect, because that means the whole transportation system, which pushes strongly towards the shortening of supply chain. COVID-19 has shown clearly this trade-off between efficiency and security. Yes, you can be secure, it will cost more, but it works in the direction of reshoring and nearshoring. But then sustainability, brings more economic sense to that, because then you have to think not only about the narrowly defined profitability, but you have to think about the environmental cost of your kind of global value chain. So let's hope that sustainability will not become a victim of geopolitics, and the next climate change summit is obviously one of the milestones on that route, and will tell us a lot in which direction the nature of globalization will evolve, because this issue cannot be solved without multilateralism. On positive side, if there is anything positive in Ukraine war, if there is anything positive, this is that it kind of clearly pushed at least Europe more towards sustainability. So in that respect, kind of this was maybe a trigger which pushed under very, very high cost. It's tragically that we are paying this type of cost, but if there is anything positive, then it is push this transformation towards the greening of energy system and the overall energy independence. To finish that on the geopolitics side, it's important to understand that this is not something which started today. It's not something which started with the US-China potential decoupling. It started actually with 9/11, where for the first time we could see a reassertion of geopolitics and state power. And that led to, international political economy type of realists who basically were always arguing that the nation state continues to be the major actor in domestic and international affairs. And basically globalization is just an order which is established by the hegemon. Of course, in any such a system, the degree of state autonomy of each individual state is dependent on its national size and economic power, and that is the reason why we have this kind of today potential and very, very kind of dangerous supply chain disruptions, which may come through this U.S.-China decoupling, and Ukraine war is one clear piece of evidence of the relevance of the geopolitics, which kind of I personally never thought that I will have to want to read much about it, but now it becomes extremely important for all of us. So this was my take on these four forces, which are structural factors which are driving towards the slowbalization or deglobalization, if you want. And I would like now in the rest to focus on our part of the world. I would like to focus on the Europe, and especially on Central Eastern Europe. And in that respect, Europe is actually highly integrated in global economy. Here I have from a very recent, very nice piece of paper by a group of Italian colleagues, which is just exactly the type of evidence which we needed in this case. Here we see the data on the regional value added, which is the compared to the global foreign value added as a share of final output. And what we see here, so this is the share of the regional value added which is produced in Europe, and we see that this is a kind of rising. We also see that the Europe is increasingly dependent on the foreign global value chains, but this is kind of now declining if you look at just very recent period, although there is a very recently some kind of rebounding on that. So in a sense, Europe is becoming more integrated in terms of value chain, but as I will point in a minute, it's also becoming increasingly dependent on foreign demand. And when you compare it to Asia Pacific, we see here a sharp decline in global sourcing and a very stagnant situation. Also North and Latin America, we see a slowly declining global and low levels of regional sourcing, which goes towards this kind of argument that actually globalization was never truly globalization, but is more about the regionalization. And in the current context, we see that these actually trends are recent trends. So we have phenomenon of this nearshoring, and in case of Europe, this far shoring is relatively stagnating. There is this evidence that Europe is increasing in sourcing value added from within the region, but also, which is quite relevant from the macroeconomic perspective, that Europe has become increasingly dependent on foreign demand. So this kind of is a contradiction in itself, because the drivers of Europe and the continent is not big to generate its own demand. So it has to do with the whole issue of macroeconomic policy. We cannot enter into that now, but this will be kind of also a limit to this model of growth, which is largely based on just exporting. I mean, the country behind that is obviously Germany, but we see here that this German growth model in the new context may become faced with much more difficulties, but we see that this is reflected also at the EU level. Now, if we come to Central Eastern Europe, then what we see here a kind of strong backward and integration, and also backward or forward integration. Here we have a very nice data from a colleague from LSE who have done one study for the European Commission, where we see here on the horizontal axis, we see a degree of backward integration. And on the vertical line, we see forward linkages, forward integration, and we see where is the Central Eastern Europe. I put them here and kind of in this circle, and you see they are either highly backward integrated, or they are integrating from both sides. Estonia is here somewhere in this bunch with the countries which have a strong backward integration. Okay, this is you can look at it later. This is simply the what is here in this graph. This is the explanation backward integration. These are share of foreign value added in total exports of a country. So this is basically your assembly type of factory, and forward linkages where you are also you have your value added which you are exporting, but at the same time, if you have a backward linkages, then you are also assembly economy. So you have a kind of highly integrated. And so we see that Bulgaria, Estonia, Hungary, Lithuania, and Slovakia, they belong to this group of highly backward integrated kind of. Slovakia being an example of branch plant economy, kind of the best example in that context. From the perspective of the region, what is very important in that context is a kind of technology upgrading. And one very imperfect way, but very nice way how you can look at it is it comes from the database Market FDI, which has a data on specific projects which are in individual countries, and these projects are classified based on their functional specialization, whether they're in production, whether they're in R&D, they're in marketing, in distribution, in services. And we can develop a measure which is called the relative functional specialization. A relative functional specialization is your ratio between number of projects which are in production activities and number of projects which are in non-production activities, or within project, type of activity. So you sum all that up. In non-production activities, you can think about the headquarters services, R&D, sales, business services, and so on. So in this figure, this is produced by colleagues from Vienna Institute. You take that the EU average is 1, so it's somewhere here down. And what we see here, we see that if you take Visegrad, Slovenia, these are Central European countries which are kind of highly integrated. We see that they are all kind of 2 times more specialized in production activities than the European average. So that's the first thing. So, and the second important is that we don't see really improvements in relative functional specialization in terms of moving more towards the non-production activities where the supposedly value added is a higher kind of. So that tells us that these economies are still kind of in that respect not moving very much forward. So there is something which this colleague from Vienna called functional development track, which is the idea that if a region wants to move forward, then it should cost more headquarters, more logistic, marketing, research, development, and so on. And being instead kind of just a European factory economy will sooner or later lead you to stagnation. Of course, this is all with the idea that the China still operate as a factory economy, but if that is not the case, then the whole this issue could be rethought. I think this is something which we can really then have a nice discussion, especially in the context of new technologies, additive manufacturing, kind of where nearshoring is coming now as driven by the nature of new technologies. Now, to give a few more bits and pieces of evidence of this, here we have changes. This is again from the second paper from Italian colleagues, which have a nice data based on input-output tables and trade in value added combined, where we see change in backward participation and change in forward participation for all European countries. And here I have again highlighted Central East European countries, where you have 3 groups. Baltic countries are all here, where we see a strong increase in the average level of integration. So in that respect, we see what would be expected, kind of closer integration of these economies within the European system. Of course, there are variations here, but for us, it's crucial that majority of these countries have this both and backward and forward integration. Now, if you look at more closely here we have a piece of evidence which shows what is the average share of countries in terms of high-tech manufacturing. And what you can see here, that the several Central European countries, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, they have a high share of high-tech manufacturing. Now, of course, the issue is here whether high-tech is really high-tech, because you don't take here the value-added element here. This is based on the classification, which classifies you based on R&D intensities. And here we see a change in share of high-tech. So we can see that some of them are high-tech, at least nominally focused, and most of them actually not really much. But when we look at the changes in the share, then we see that this is only in some of the countries. We see that here Estonia and many other countries actually do not have this kind of, we see a shift towards the high-tech integration, but this is a kind of, the starting levels are quite different, but in overall kind of, this is the element which is one could say relatively positive. What is actually the element which gives a light or explain better this picture, and that's where kind of optimism of this kind is not really grounded, is when you take into account on one hand, average share of high-tech manufacturing, which is seen in the previous picture, but then you look more behind what is within, sorry, this is the right slide. Where we take the knowledge element of the high tech, and that is our technology sophisticated activities, and that is those activities where we have a knowledge intensive occupations. And when we look at that aspect, which is a much more direct indicator of the knowledge intensity, then we see here on the horizontal axis, we see average share of knowledge intensive business services in GVCs. And here we have, as you would expect, that the Central Eastern Europe is at the end, at the tail of it, at the end, and the left side here. Here we see Lithuania is on the bottom. Here we see Estonia in this group, and for some kind of a reason which I still cannot figure out, country where I come from, Croatia is actually leading in this case. Then when we look at the changes in shares, then we see that the picture is much less kind of optimistic. We've seen before the above average increase in high-tech manufacturing, but when we look at the knowledge intensive occupations, then we see that we don't see this kind of upgrading, which points that and this is one the major conclusion. My final point here is that we still see this division within the Europe on headquarters and factory economies, kind of, and which has a huge implications, it's a huge challenge how Central Eastern Europe will develop in the future. Of course, you know, it depends on the overall globalization processes, but in terms of upgrading, one would want to see getting out this functional chap that colleagues from Vienna were talking. Just a final point about our direct neighborhood, which is the Russia and Ukraine. The point why I'm putting it, because the processes which we have seen with these two, for us, very important neighbors, are not of yesterday. It's not only related to war, but here we see data which shows us domestic value added and foreign value added in two economies. And we see that this situation in Russia of very limited kind of, or delinking, that this is something which was obviously structurally given by the nature of Russian economy, but this delinking also started before 2014 here, and especially low share of the foreign value added. And in case of Ukraine, we see a process of increasing integration in terms of decreasing share of domestic value added and increasing share of the foreign value added, which means that the models of these two countries, you would expect, and as they will develop probably in the future, will be quite different. So the linking of Russia started before 2014, and Ukrainian GVC integration is driven by both forward and backward linkages, and we see that this is process which was obviously facilitated after 2014. Russia still plays a very important role in some CE countries. You know it very well, our dependence in terms of energy sector and while dependence on Ukraine is much less significant, and the issue is how to build actually that. Okay, so this was a kind of about the region, which where my main point was that region will be seriously affected by the globalization and deglobalization trends. It's firmly specialized as a factory economies type of region, and we see limited technology upgrading. If you take a variety of indicators, not only knowledge in intensive knowledge-intensive occupations. My final point, and this is just last slide before conclusions, what state could do here? It's a huge agenda, and I simply, I've run now out of time here. For the discussion, I just want to put what are the possible state roles in this context. Because that is such a serious topic and is changing before our eyes, so would really require much more thinking. And this is at least a nice paper which offers us a possible role of states within the global value chains. State can be facilitator, assisting firms in relation to global value chain. Some countries are doing that in Europe. As a regulator, this is obvious now through this restrictions or facilitations on FDI. As a producer, this is something which comes through public procurement, increasingly not in Europe through ownership, but things may change in that respect as the notion of strategic industries develops further, and state as a buyer. So in this context, I will not go deep any more into that. I just put this as a menu of options that we can discuss and see what is going on. In the conclusions, let me just point to three things. First is that the argument based on all of this is that the international business in the new conditions, and this is maybe still not obvious to many, I would say academics, maybe to business people, yes, under international business under this globalization, or deglobalization, will look qualitatively different from what we have seen in the past decades. That is quite important to understand. How qualitatively different, we still don't know clearly, but the new agenda for research is such that it requires much deeper integration of political research and integration of political forces in international business research. This is something which international business scholars were not thinking about, but the study of the interplay between multinationals and the political context, I think this is something which is becoming today almost imperative. I cannot think of doing any more realistic research on international business without bringing political economy context into the whole story. So this is where I will end. I hope it was maybe too rushed, and my mouse didn't work well, but I'm looking forward to fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.